The whole
syndicate, the whole organization.
That's right, yeah.
Why do you feel like it should be destroyed?
Well, through the years, first of all, I want revenge. Second of all, they've been very bad to the soldiers. And they've been thinking for themselves all through the years.
Otherwise,
and all put together. I could put together a number of, so many things that it all comes to all one to destroy them.
There are just many reasons that add up to the fact
right.
You don't think that such an organization should be permitted to operate, to
That's
exist.
right.
Is that correct?
That's right. As the senator put it before, what did I get out of it?
What'd you get out of it?
Nothing but misery. As you all understand, once you're in, you can't get out.
In the long and violent history of the American Mafia, thousands of men lived and died by a single unbreakable oath, the Code of Silence, or Omertà. It was a sacred vow that protected a criminal empire from the outside world. But in the fall of 1963, one man shattered that code on national television. He was a career criminal, a simple soldier, not a boss, and his decision to talk didn't just expose the secrets of the mob, it gave law enforcement the blueprint they needed to begin to dismantle it. This is the story of a man who sold out the syndicate, not for justice, but for revenge and survival. Welcome back to James on the Mob. I'm James Jenkins, host and narrator. In this episode, we'll tell the story of Joseph Valachi, a disenchanted soldier in the Genovese crime family who stepped into the lights and cameras of the U.S. Senate McClellan Committee on Organized Crime and did what no made man had dared to do before. He testified voluntarily and publicly under threat of death from his boss, Vito Genovese, a man who had served as best man at his wedding, and from the criminal organization he had faithfully served for over 30 years because of Genovese's paranoid perceptions. And through his these, those, and them articulation, he lifted the veil of secrecy off the secret society he would identify as Cosa Nostra. Joseph Michael Valachi's journey began in East Harlem, New York City, where he was born to impoverished Italian immigrant parents on September 22, 1904. He was one of 17 children, of which only 6 survived. He later blamed his rough upbringing and violent alcoholic father for his turn to crime. Valachi's education only went as far as the 7th grade. His criminal career began not within the organized crime syndicate, but with a small independent burglary gang working out of East Harlem's 107th Street, known as the Minutemen. The gang earned its name for its method of operation: smash and grab burglaries that were executed and completed within a minute. Valachi's role as the gang's getaway driver was a formative experience, and his skill at making a quick escape earned him an early reputation within the New York City criminal underworld. This initial success was short-lived, however, as his criminal activities led to early arrests. He was arrested on charges of grand larceny in 1921 and for attempted burglary in 1925, for which he pleaded guilty and served a 3-year sentence in Sing Sing prison. While in prison, Valachi got an education on the wider world through an old-time gangster named Alessandro Valero. Valero, who had been jailed for the murder of Nicholas Terranova during the Mafia Camorra War of the 1910s, Terranova had been boss of the family Valachi would eventually join. Valero schooled Valachi on the rivalry between Sicilians and Neapolitans and gave Valachi an insight about the life he would soon become a part of. These formative years with a localized gang and jailhouse education represent the beginnings of a life in crime that Valachi in later life would help to expose. After being released from Sing Sing, Valachi continued to engage in burglaries and petty crimes. But petty crime and local gangs were a dead-end street. In 1929, his journey from a member of a small-time independent gang to a formally inducted mafioso began to take shape as he joined up with another Sing Sing pal, Dominic the Gap Petrilli, a member of the Gaetano Reyna family based in the Bronx. Valachi admired Petrilli's expensive clothes and his tough guy personality. And when Valachi inquired about how he could become mobbed up, the Gap told him to sit tight, keep in touch, and that everything would be all right. Valachi didn't have very long to wait. In early 1930, the American Mafia was embroiled in a bloody civil war known as the Castellammarese War. It was a generational clash between two mustache Petes, the old world bosses who clung to tradition, and a new breed of Americanized mobsters who saw crime as a business to be modernized. The conflict pitted the faction of Giuseppe Joe the Boss Mazzaria against that of Salvador Maranzano, leader of the Castellammarese faction, both who were mustache Petes, for control of illegal operations in the United States. And although law enforcement authorities were aware of this war, it wasn't until Valachi gave the details 30 years later that a more complete picture was painted. On February 26, 1930, Gaetano Reyna was murdered by Masseria gunmen Vito Genovese and Joseph Pinzolo. Reyna had refused to be shaken down for more profits from the ice racket. Pinzolo would be installed as boss of the family, but himself was killed by gunmen working for Reyna loyalists Gaetano Gagliano and Thomas Three-Finger Brown Lucchese. Reyna's murder would unite his group with that of the Maranzano forces. Valachi was formally inducted as a made man into the American Mafia after participating in a contract, his first, on two Mazzaria loyalists, Al Maneo and Steve Ferrigno, on November 5, 1930. Shortly afterward, Valachi was inducted into the Mafia by Salvador Maranzano himself. He joined the Reyna family, which would later be known as the Lucchese family. The war went on, back and forth, a shooting here, a stabbing there, until that new breed of Americanized gangsters led by Charles Lucky Luciano decided enough. Luciano, who worked for Mazzaria, approached Maranzano and made a deal with him, where Mazzaria would be eliminated to achieve peace. And on April 15, 1931, at a Coney Island restaurant in Brooklyn, Joe the Boss was shot in the back and the head. The war was over, right? Not. Maranzano, who went on to proclaim himself boss of bosses, had a reign that was short-lived as he planned a new war to eliminate Luciano and his followers. According to Valachi, Maranzano told him this. Valachi was one of his bodyguards. But on September 10, 1931, the day Maranzano was murdered by four men posing as IRS agents, Valachi was on a double date with his friend Dominic the Gap Petrilli, who had advanced knowledge of what was to come, but omitted to tell Valachi, probably saving his life. What a pal, eh? After Maranzano's death, Valachi went into hiding. As a Maranzano bodyguard, he had expected to be hunted down and killed to prevent a comeback of Maranzano loyalists. Valachi hid out at the home of former boss Gaetano Reyna, while he made an appeal to Thomas Lucchese, the new Gagliano family underboss. A meeting was set up with Luciano family underboss Vito Genovese, and although Valachi had hoped to go back to the Gagliano family, he ended up in the Luciano family. Quick side note, Valachi was one of the few members to have ever been in three different families, the Lucchese, Bonanno, and Genovese families. Luciano and his allies created a new national governing body called the Commission to mediate disputes and prevent future wars. And in this new structure, Valachi settled in as a soldado or a soldier in what would later be known as the Genovese crime family. With the turbulence of the Castellammarese War behind him and his place in the mob's new order sealed, Valachi was able to begin his life as a made member of the Luciano crime family. He was a true foot soldier, a member of the Greenwich Village crew led by Anthony Tony Bender Strollo, who carried out day-to-day work of the organization. With Prohibition drawing to a close, the mob's focus shifted from bootlegging to a new generation of criminal rackets. For Valachi, this meant a life spent in the middle-level echelons of crime, with interest chiefly in the numbers rackets, loan sharking, other forms of gambling, and later narcotics. At this point, Valachi began thinking family. While hiding out at the Reyna household after Maranzano's murder, Valachi met and began a courtship with the oldest daughter of slain mob boss Gaetano Reyna. Her name was Mildred, and they married on September 18, 1932. Together they would have one son. And, oh yeah, Vito Genovese was the best man. His life as a mob soldier stood in stark contrast to the higher-ranking figures of the time. He was not much affected by the headline stories of the day, like in June of 1936, when his boss, Lucky Luciano, was convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison for being the head of a major prostitution ring, or that of underboss Vito Genovese, who fled to Italy in 1937 with $750,000 to avoid being prosecuted for a murder he had sanctioned in 1934. While men like Frank Costello, who became the acting boss of the family in 1937, were building a vast empire of political influence and legitimate business, Valachi was immersed in the street-level criminal operations. Costello, for example, expanded the family's interest into slot machines in Louisiana and illegal gambling in Florida and Cuba, all the while cultivating a public persona as the prime minister of the underworld. This was a world of diplomacy and politics, a far cry from the violent day-to-day work of a soldado like Valachi. This difference in approach, Costello's from Genovese's, would eventually come to define the long and brutal power struggle between Costello and Vito Genovese, a conflict that would have a devastating effect on Valachi himself. The opening years of the 1940s saw Valachi modestly rising in wealth and stature. In addition to his illegal businesses, Valachi, through his loan sharking, came to gain interest in his first restaurant, The Paradise, located in Manhattan, and a Bronx dress factory, the Prospect Dress and Negligee Company. Valachi also indulged in the sport of kings and came to own a racehorse, Knight's Duchess. However, when World War II began for the U.S., certain economic dynamics began to change. Because of the jobs created by the war, his numbers and loan sharking businesses began to suffer. And to make the situation worse, Valachi had to sell his restaurant as the demographics of that part of Harlem began to change from Italian to African American. The only real moneymaker he had left was the dress factory, which was producing uniforms for the war effort. And as almost everything else in the country was being rationed, Valachi got into the business of selling stolen black market ration stamps. 1946 was a pivotal year in Valachi's life and career, as a number of events would transpire that would lead him to his eventual fate. In February 1946, Charlie Lucky Luciano had his sentence commuted for his alleged assistance to the United States Navy during World War II. However, Luciano was ordered deported to Italy. In June 1946, Vito Genovese returned from Italy after having collaborated with the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini and was cleared of his 1934 murder charge. Genovese quickly started opening up drug links to Europe and began his quest to take charge of the Luciano family from boss Frank Costello. Valachi also acquired another restaurant in 1946. It was located in the Castle Hill section of the Bronx and was called the Lido. Valachi had gone into a partnership in this venture with another mobster from the Mangano family, Frank Luciano, no relation to Charlie Lucky, who had been his partner in the black market ration stamp racket. Luciano had a serious gambling problem and began to steal from restaurant profits. When Valachi confronted him about this, Luciano showed indifference. Valachi was angered and beat him down to the point where Frank Luciano was unconscious. Valachi had just broken one of the top commandments of the Mafia: never lay your hands on another member. Valachi immediately reported this to his captain, Tony Bender, and family underboss, Guarino Willie Moretti. A sit-down was called where Mangano underboss Albert the Mad Hatter Anastasia would be the final arbiter. Valachi became extremely nervous, as Anastasia was well known for his kill 'em all reputation. He was both surprised and relieved when Anastasia ruled in his favor and ruled that he would keep the restaurant and buy Luciano out for $3,500. The 1950s should have been Joe Valachi's prime years. He had a wife, a family, steady rackets, and had pretty good standing in the family. But instead, this decade would drag him deeper into blood, betrayal, and the kind of business that Cosa Nostra pretended to forbid. And though he still engaged in murder contracts, at this point in his career, he supervised and coordinated these contracts. Eugenio Gene Giannini was a flashy Lucchese soldier with a dangerous flaw. He was also an informant for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Giannini knew too much about the heroin routes flowing from Marseille, France, through Havana, Cuba, into New York. Routes blessed by Lucky Luciano in exile and expanded by Vito Genovese. Somehow, Luciano had discovered a letter that Giannini wrote to his Bureau of Narcotics handlers. The order filtered down. Luciano and Genovese wanted him gone. Tony Bender passed the contract to Valachi. Valachi pulled the crew together. Joe and Pat Pagano and Fiore Ciano, who was Valachi's nephew. One night late on September 20th, 1952, Giannini was cut down on the streets of the Bronx. The case went unsolved for a decade until Valachi finally told the world what had happened. Stevie Franzi had been a loyal caretaker for Vito Genovese during his years in Italy and was supposed to keep an eye on Genovese's wife Anna. But when Anna turned on Vito in open court, Franzi sided with her. To Vito, it was betrayal. The job came again to Valachi. On June 19, 1953, he lured Franzi to his Bronx restaurant Valito, promising a quiet sit-down. Instead, once inside, Franzi was strangled to death by Pasquale Pagano and Fiore Ciano. Franzi's body was dumped, another message killing, another ghost that would follow Valachi into testimony a decade later. Despite Frank Costello's public ban on drugs in 1948, heroin was becoming the real money in New York. Genovese and Tony Bender tapped into the French Connection pipeline, funneling shipments across the Atlantic. Valachi bought in. At first, the cash flowed fast and easy, more than jukeboxes, more than restaurants, more than his dress factory ever brought in. But the higher he climbed, the dirtier the game got. Valachi staked serious money on a Marseille shipment, expecting a fair cut. When the load landed, Tony Bender and Genovese sliced the pie in secret. Valachi and Pat Pagano would toss scraps, 2 kilos each, a fraction of what they had been promised. The lesson was clear. In narcotics, the bosses always won. Soldiers were just gamblers, paid in crumbs. On May 2nd, 1957, Frank Costello was shot by Genovese gunman Vincent the Chin Gigante in the vestibule of his apartment. Costello survived, but one bullet ended in error. Frank Costello stepped aside and Vito Genovese crowned himself the new boss. But Genovese's victory came with a curse, the kind of power that brings every eye, every whisper, and every ambition against you. On October 25th, 1957, Albert Anastasia, remember the kill guy, walked into the Park Sheridan Hotel barbershop in Midtown Manhattan. He never walked out. 2 masked gunmen stormed in, and with his eyes covered, Anastasia never saw them coming. Shots rang out. He lunged from the chair, striking at the shadows in the mirror, then collapsed in a pool of his own blood. Behind the bullets was Vito Genovese. Fresh from forcing Frank Costello aside, Genovese wanted full control, but Anastasia stood in the way. A volatile rival, unpredictable and dangerous. His murder cleared the path for Genovese's ascendancy. With Anastasia gone, the newly named Genovese family rose to the top of the underworld. But the blood in that barbershop foreshadowed the chaos that was coming. On November 14, 1957, Genovese called a national mafia summit at Apalachin, New York. State troopers stumbled on it, sending dozens of mobsters running for the woods. Genovese wanted to show the world he was boss of bosses. Instead, he showed the world the mafia existed. Headlines blared, investigators circled. The power he had stolen now painted a target on his chest. By late 1958, Vito Genovese had clawed his way to the top. Costello was retired, Anastasia was dead, and Genovese was the boss of the most powerful family in New York. But power made him reckless. He saw heroin as the new empire, the true source of money and muscle. Heroin shipments moved through Cuba, through Italy, through the French Connection. But the same trade that filled his pockets also brought the heat. In 1958, undercover Federal Bureau of Narcotics agents tied Genovese to a massive heroin deal. The net closed fast. He was indicted and tried. and in April of 1959, he was convicted on federal narcotics charges. The man who thought he was untouchable was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Vito Genovese, once the would-be boss of bosses, was led away in chains, his empire crumbling as he walked through the prison gates. And also in 1959, federal investigators caught Valachi in a narcotics case tied to heroin distribution. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison in Atlanta Penitentiary. For Joe Valachi, the conviction was more than a prison sentence. It was a death sentence in slow motion. Locked inside with Vito Genovese, he was one step closer to the day he would break omertà. At some point, Genovese, for some reasons that remain unclear, began to suspect that Valachi was an informant. In June 1962, he made a move that was meant to be a death sentence. He gave Valachi the kiss of death, a symbolic gesture that signaled to the organization that a man was marked for execution. Valachi was terrified. 3 attempts on his life had already been made, once in the prison shower, a poison attempt, and an attempt to goad him into a fight. He had tried to send a letter out to Lucchese boss Thomas Lucchese so that maybe he could intervene, but the letter was sent back to him by the Bureau of Prisons. Fearful of eating and desperate, Valachi made a tragic mistake. On June 22, 1962, he used a pipe to bludgeon an inmate to death, mistakenly believing he was Joseph Joe Beck di Palermo, a hitman sent by Genovese to kill him. But the man he killed was John Joseph Salp, a loner convict with no ties to organized crime. This impulsive act of self-preservation earned him a life sentence for murder and convinced him that his only hope for survival was to break the mob's sacred code of silence. His life as a loyal soldier was over. His new life as an informant, a traitor, and an unlikely public hero was about to begin. In September 1963, Joseph Valachi was brought before the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. The hearings, chaired by Senator John L. McClellan, were a national sensation. For the first time, Americans were about to hear the truth about the underworld from a person who lived in it. Valachi's testimony was a bombshell. Prior to this, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI had no concrete evidence that a unified national crime syndicate even existed. Valachi's revelations changed everything. He provided a detailed first-person blueprint of the mob's hidden world. He told them that the term mafia was an outsider's word and that members referred to the organization as Cosa Nostra, meaning our thing. He then laid out the intricate command structure of the 5 families, from the commission at the top to the boss, the underboss, and the cancelliere or counselor, the capo regimes or captains, and finally the soldato, soldiers, like he himself was. He even detailed the secret blood initiation ceremony. Valachi also provided the names, family trees, and information that helped solve the numerous unsolved gangland murders, including the slayings of Gene Giannini and Albert Anastasia. His testimony did not lead to immediate prosecutions, but its true power was in its function as a massive intelligence breakthrough for law enforcement. The Justice Department now had a verified roadmap to the entire criminal enterprise. The ultimate impact of Joseph Valachi's testimony was not felt in a courtroom, but in the halls of Congress. His revelations created a national political and public will to fight organized crime on a systemic level. It provided the justification for a new legal era. In 1968, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act was passed, which included provisions for wiretaps. And in 1970, Congress enacted the landmark Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO. This law, designed to prosecute entire criminal organizations rather than just individuals, became the single most powerful tool in the government's arsenal against the mob in the next generation. For the public, Valachi became the face of American underworld gangster. The televised hearings stripped away the romantic myths of the mob, replacing them with a frightening reality that millions of Americans saw with their own eyes. As for Valachi himself, his life ended in isolation. He was placed under government protection in a specialized secluded prison cell in La Tuna, Texas. He died of a heart attack in federal prison in 1971. He was 67 years old, 2 years after Vito Genovese died of a heart attack in 1969. His betrayal, born of fear and revenge, provided the ultimate vindication for law enforcement. So goes the story of Joe Valachi. He was a simple soldier, but his words brought the entire public government of organized crime into the light and ultimately gave it the kiss of death it had given him. In the comments below, let me know if you were in the same situation as Valachi. Would you have done the same thing? Let me know. I'm James Jenkins. If you've enjoyed this episode, hit that like button, subscribe, share, and stay tuned for another episode of James on the Mob. And remember, life is short, so don't whack it off. See yous.